All right, I know I'm wearing a Sega shirt for a video that's all about Sony, but the beanie balances it out. Think of it this way, I'm wearing this in memory of Sony killing the Dreamcast, I guess. I don't know, that's probably too mean. I'm sorry, Dreamcast. With the recent release of the PS5 and PS5 All Digital, I wanted to take a step back and look at the evolution of the PlayStation console. This is something I already took a look at with the Xbox when we got those early dummy units, and now that we have our hands on PlayStation 5s, I think now is the time to give that its proper due. And take it even farther back, I want to start with actually going over the origins of PlayStation, because this is probably one of my favorite stories when it comes to why a company started making gaming systems. See, back in the early 90s, PlayStation was working with Nintendo to release a CD-based attachment for the SNES, or the Super Famicom specifically. Where this all goes wrong is CES 1991, where Sony shows off part of their new partnership with Nintendo, revealing their PlayStation system, the Super Famicom CD, only to have the following day, Nintendo announce, hey, we're not working with Sony, we're working with Philips now to make a CD-based system, which, by the way, never happened, but did get us the Philips CDI Zelda games that are still a horrible, horrible mistake. Obviously, this comes as a surprise to Sony, who is not very happy about it, leading to eventually in 1994 when they release their own gaming system, the Sony PlayStation. And as it turns out for Sony, this was a great move because the original PlayStation is a big success. A large part of this being the fact that it is one of the first major systems to really embrace doing a CD-based system. The PlayStation was not the first one to do it, it was just really the first one to pull it off. See, the reason why other companies, including Nintendo, were hesitant to go to CD-based stuff is because cart-based was something that was easier to control, it was something that was a little more protected against piracy, and one of the major benefits it had over disc-based technologies is that it allowed for much faster loading times, which weren't really a super noticeable thing back on the NES or SNES. Now, while these were downsides that did in fact impact the PlayStation in comparison to its competition, the one thing it did open up is allow for a lot more space on discs for game developers to do what they want with their games. While there was certainly a sort of power battle in terms of what systems were capable of, carts heavily limited what was possible in terms of how large a game could be, which on a disc on the PlayStation allowed developers to do a lot more. And so a lot of third-party companies started moving over to PlayStation. People like Konami and Capcom, who still made things for the N64, but started bringing a lot more franchises over to the PlayStation. And what is definitely the largest example of this is, of course, Square bringing the Final Fantasy franchise to PlayStation with FF7, one of the probably most historically significant launches for PlayStation ever. And what's really important about a lot of these franchises too is that not only did they find a new home on PlayStation, but a lot of their most important, really big kind of turning point games came out on this system as well. Final Fantasy VII, like we already said, for Capcom, we got the introduction of Resident Evil and more importantly, Resident Evil 2. And Konami had some really big hits with Metal Gear Solid happening on the original PlayStation and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Both franchises that again, originally had entries released on the Nintendo, but had their really big hit releases happen later. You know, it's really funny because personally, I didn't actually grow up with a PS1 in my own household. It was kind of the system that I played at a lot of friends' houses. I had always been Nintendo systems in my home until about the PS2. But even then, the PlayStation really has, I think, one of my absolute favorite libraries of games ever. Really, a lot of my PS2 time was dedicated to even playing PS1 games in backwards compatibility. Now, from a hardware standpoint, I think a lot of times people just picture there really only being two versions, the original PlayStation and the PS1. However, there was actually a lot of different hardware revisions for the original PlayStation. In fact, one of the big changes that happened over the life of that system is that while the main body looked very much the same, the ports on the back got severely reduced over time. What's also really interesting about this is the timing of its slimline revision, the PS1. Now, when we think of slimline systems nowadays, normally it's something that happens midway through a system's life cycle. It's kind of an image refresh, that kind of deal. But in the case of the PlayStation, the PS1 was actually released after the PS2 by just a couple of months. This redesigned system was considerably smaller than the original PlayStation while still maintaining some of the same general look. The button outlines and everything were very much the same, but it was smaller, rounder in appearance, and was a brighter shade of gray, really pushing more to being just more of an off-white. And like with the later versions of the original PlayStation, it further condensed down the ports on the system, really just focusing on the power and multi-AV out. One really cool thing about the PS1, which is actually not a thing I have on hand to show off, is one of the other options you had for picking it up was to grab what was called a combo pack, where it was a PS1 with an actual attachable screen, so it was a kind of little mini portable setup you could play. You would still need to have, power outlets to plug everything into, but you no longer had to rely on having an actual TV to plug into. Really, aside from these hardware changes, what really stood out as far as an evolution standpoint for the original PlayStation was the development of the controller. The original PlayStation controller that shipped with systems was actually kind of weird looking now because I'm so used to seeing sticks on it. It was a stickless design that still had all the other kind of buttons and shoulder buttons we're used to seeing, but it just looked considerably smaller without those sticks in the middle. Eventually, we got a dual analog design, which added the 2 sticks in the middle, and then a further redesigned one, which was the original DualShock, which redesigned the stick shape a bit, and of course added the rumble motors to each side. The controller design, game library, and visuals of the PlayStation helped make it a big success for its time, but all of this was really just a lead up to what ended up being the largest success in PlayStation history, really the most successful console ever made, the PS2. The PS2 capitalized on the momentum built up by the PS1 by still relying on having a great library of games, relying on the same DualShock controller design. The DualShock 2 was a little different, but for the most part was a very slight modification of the original DualShock controller. But what really helped propel this system to a whole new level of success was opening it up to a new audience by making it a very affordable DVD player. The moving of TV and movie media over from VHS to DVD was a really big step for a lot of people, and DVD players were not a cheap thing to buy. So when there's this thing on the market that says, hey, it works as a DVD player for the same or even lower price, and also happens to play video games, slightly more attractive offer for a lot of people. And so PS2s ended up flying off the shelves, so much so that the PS2 to this date is the top selling system ever, having sold almost 158 million units, and that's really only counting up until Sony was still keeping track back in 2012. Obviously, DVDs alone aren't the only reason why the system sold extremely well. It also did have an amazing catalog of games. Again, it maintained a lot of the same franchises that found a new home back on the PS1, but also introduced us into a whole lot of new franchises as well. There was this kind of renaissance of 3D platforming games with Ratchet & Clank, Sly Cooper, and Jak and Daxter, as well as brand new 3D action games that were focused on kind of almost a light beat-em-up style with Devil May Cry and God of War. All the while, classic franchises from the PS1 continued to get massive hits like Silent Hill 2 and 3, Final Fantasy X, new Tekken games. There was just a very large and very varied library of titles that were exclusive to the PS2 that helped cement it as being the go-to option out of that whole generation. And what really makes this even more impressive is that from a pure hardware standpoint, while the PS2 was an extremely efficient system, as far as raw power goes, it actually wasn't really the strongest. The GameCube was a little more powerful than the PS2, albeit it was also limited by the fact that the smaller discs on the GameCube couldn't carry as much data, so again, that same kind of advantage the PS1 had over the N64, bigger games, more space to do stuff. And the Xbox, while being a very late addition to the generation, did offer a considerably more powerful system that did help get it a little momentum in its early years, but ultimately the PS2 still came out way on top. Now, like with the original PlayStation, when people think of the PS2, they tend to focus on there really only being 2 or 3 major models, but there was actually, again, quite a number of different revisions that were just quiet inside changes. The PS2 had various redesigns over time, one of the most notable being that the original Japanese ones didn't have the expansion bay, instead favoring having a PCMCI slot, while the PS2 for the entire US run and the several models afterwards made use of that expansion bay so you could add a hard drive or modem. The most notable revision, of course, was the PS2 Slim, which was a mid-cycle refresh for the PS2. It wasn't like the PS1 where it happened all the way at the next system. But the Slim was this super teeny tiny console that still read discs. It did reallocate some space by actually putting in external power brick in order to help make that room inside the system. This, of course, had further revisions over time, some of which did run into some problems by not having the same level of compatibility with past PlayStation 1 titles, until the last major revision that happened with the 9000 models PS2 Slims. Now, these still looked mostly the same as the PS2 Slim. It still kept the same overall body, but there was a slight redesign in the look of them. It actually kind of mirrors a little bit what they did later on with the original PS4, where you have this half-gloss, half-matte black design. These models actually got rid of the external power brick while still maintaining the overall super tiny size of the PS2 Slim, which was really impressive, and also improved on the compatibility issues that some later PS2 Slim options were beginning to have. All the while, the DualShock 2 remained pretty much the same throughout the entire lifespan of the PS2. There were a lot of wacky and weird third-party options that came out, but as far as the official controller option for the PS2 goes, that remained a pretty consistent design throughout the entire lifespan. Despite the best efforts of their competition with the GameCube and the original Xbox, the PlayStation 2 absolutely dominated this generation of gaming. Again, top-selling system ever made. And it was because of this massive momentum that PlayStation was riding that Sony got maybe a little bit too cocky going into the PS3. Speaking of PS3, we should probably switch over to 16:9 now. I know, the PS2 also supported 16:9 as an option, but just bear with me, going from CRTs to, more modern TVs. Okay, I have no idea where the guidelines are. Is this right, Stevie? Stevie, is this the right idea?
Is this too far out? Stevie!
If there was any kind of low point, at least relatively, when it comes to mainline PlayStation systems, the original launch of the PS3 is it. The PlayStation 3 was an extremely ambitious system with a lot of great ideas that, in the end, didn't really pan out the way they had hoped. And there's a few different reasons why this happened, one of which was the price of the system. The PS3 launched with two different models going at $500 and $600. Now, if that already sounds high to you relative to the fact that we just got the PS5 at $400 and $500, also realize inflation is a thing. So also in terms of how much money was worth at the time back then, that is an even higher dollar amount than you're thinking right now. The systems also made use of a new cell processor that was very powerful for its time, but also was much trickier to develop for and wasn't something that a lot of companies were quite as prepared to work with. So while in concept the PS3 was a very powerful system if leveraged properly, a lot of games weren't very well optimized for it, so you were seeing a lot of situations where PS3 versions of multi-platform games were not running as well or were having major bug issues. And what made both these problems even larger is the combined competition that PlayStation was seeing going up against the Nintendo Wii, which was a massive success despite being a very different kind of system, and a more direct competitor in the form of the Xbox 360, having a whole extra year out and really putting a lot of work into pioneering the online multiplayer aspect of things, which PlayStation 3 eventually caught up to but didn't really have prepped at launch. Now, none of this is to say the PS3 ended up being an awful system. It really wasn't. It just had a lot of difficulties and problems at the outset that eventually got fixed over time with the release of additional model options, reduced pricing, system updates that offered a lot of new features and functions that were missing early on launch, and eventually a lot of games just actually being made better for the system, whether that's having multi-platform games perform better or having some truly amazing looking games coming out near the end of the PS3's life cycle. Now, speaking of models, the PS3 did go through quite a few revisions, which you can roughly break down into really kind of 5 main times. There were the original launch versions of the PS3, which featured full hardware-based backwards compatibility with the PS2. Not too long after this was a revised model that dropped the hardware-based PS2 backwards compatibility, but still offered backwards compatibility in the form of a software-based approach, and it came with an 80 gig hard drive, all which helped make it reduce a little bit in price while still offering a lot of similar features. Following this, there was a final run of original PS3 models that completely dropped the backwards compatibility in exchange for making something that was running cooler, it was lighter, and ultimately was a slightly more affordable version of the system. After these, we then got the PS3 Slim, which is my personal favorite of the different models as far as just pure looks go. Yes, it sucks that it still didn't have that PS2 backwards compatibility, but it was a much smaller, quieter system, and personally, I'm just really glad it ditched the gloss look. That's one of those things where I find systems just look really nice at first, but as they slowly accumulate scratches and other things, not so much. So I really like the approach they took with the design of the PS3 Slim. There was eventually then a final revision which happened not too long before the release of the PS4 with the PS3 Super Slim. The real main goal of this system wasn't so much to be a smaller, lighter system, but it was really focused purely on making the system as affordable as possible, resulting in a smaller system that also felt quite a bit cheaper to the touch and even included some very odd drawbacks, like for the fact that instead of having a traditional disc tray or disc slot, actually had an old school just slide top that'll give you the place to put your disc in, which wasn't great. While it certainly had a shaky start, the PS3 was able to bounce back very well over the course of its lifetime due to these various re-releases, as well as, again, just better games coming out, eventually resulting in having basically neck and neck sales with the Xbox 360. If you get down to individual territories, there's a little bit of a game of who won where, but in the end, they really came back strong and helped set themselves up for another strong start with the PlayStation 4. Released in November of 2013, the PS4 was a new, fresh start for Sony and had an amazing opening compared to its competition. While part of this can of course be attributed to the popularity of certain major first-party titles, especially some coming out near the end of the PS3, with people being hopeful of seeing what would happen on the next system, one very large aspect of this was also the fact that their competition at the time, Xbox with the Xbox One, actively bothered a lot of their audience due to confused messaging on how they were handling digital games. So much so that PlayStation has probably one of their most press conferences at E3 showing off a big selling point of the PS4, handing a game over to a friend so they can borrow and play it.
Thanks.
The PS4 was a much more focused system at the start than the PS3, with much clearer messaging, with a very heavy emphasis on it being first and foremost a gaming system. The PS3 had toyed a little bit more with some media aspects, as well as trying to open up some Wii-like gameplay with the PlayStation Move controllers, whereas the PS4 really kind of ditched a lot of that right away to instead just focus on a lot of its stronger launch title games. This isn't to say that the system didn't have any of its own little quirks at launch. There were certainly some new ideas they were trying out. For instance, a PlayStation app, which would allow you to have additional functionalities with some games if used at the same time. Eventually, this was also kind of tapped in for opening services like Remote Play. And the PS4 did come with, at least up till then, one of the most noticeable redesigns in their controllers with the DualShock 4. Well, the DualShock 2 was basically just a black version of the DualShock 1, and the DualShock 3 added things like 6-axis support and some slightly different design controls. The DualShock 4 had a redesigned grip style, a new share button for easy access to social media uses, like being able to capture a screenshot or record gameplay, and of course, the touchpad. A control method that was incorporated very heavily into a lot of first-party titles in the PS4, which honestly kind of eventually went out of use. There were still games that made use of at least pressing the touchpad itself, but as far as using the fine control of it, it became a very specialized thing that only a small handful of games really made use of. Combining the great press they had at the initial launch of the system alongside being the stronger of the two compared to the Xbox One, the PS4 leaned hard into its first-party and third-party game support, including having multi-platform games that just ran better on the system, even if only marginally in some instances, and some incredible first-party titles with early releases continuing franchises like Infamous and Uncharted, and later games even following up things like Last of Us, and a lot of brand new great first-party titles, including Horizon Zero Dawn, Bloodborne, Spider-Man, near the end of the life cycle, obviously Ghosts of Tsushima, and midway through, of course, rebooting God of War with a new gameplay style and much more somber storytelling. As far as hardware revisions for this system goes, this is actually one of the more interesting times in history because there's something that happened a little bit different than usual. There is, of course, the original PS4, which focused on that kind of half-matte, half-gloss design, which I admittedly did actually really like. Again, like I said with PS3, I don't love gloss, but I did like this kind of mixed approach they did, and it featured, of course, these hard edges. Eventually, this was slimmed down into the PS4 Slim, which rounded the edges and made for a much smaller system, and then one of the more interesting mid-cycle releases was, of course, the introduction of 0.5 systems with the PS4 Pro, a system that, rather than focusing on just being cheaper or smaller than the original version, instead focused on being a more powerful system that could play the same library of games, but with enhancements not previously possible, including supporting higher resolutions or higher frame rates, or just various other little enhancements that may not have been possible on specific game-by-game bases. While certainly not the same level of absolute dominance that the PS2 had during its generation, the PS4 maintained a solid lead over its competition over the rest of its life cycle, leading into, of course, this year with the release of the PS5. Having released just a couple weeks ago, we now have our hands on the brand new PS5, which, kind of like with the PS3, has launched with two different models coming at two different prices, particularly the physical and all digital. What is kind of a first, though, is the actual approach of why these models are different, offering the same specs, the same number of ports, everything, except for the fact that the all digital is removed a disk drive. And honestly, this is the system that I think is really the main concept of PS5 as far as Sony is concerned. You could even tell that with the very new approach they've taken to the design of the system, that the all-digital looks much more like the intentional goal of what they wanted the system to be, with the physical design adding that disk slot where it would most make sense. After having focused so long on the entire pure blackout design that started with the PS2 and carried on all the way through the PS4's life cycle, they've now gone for this two-color approach where you have these white plates on either side of the system with this kind of just light, almost alien curvature going on, while still maintaining a more traditional blackout design on the middle section of the system, highlighted with these awesome little blue lights while it's running. Each new generation of PlayStation is always kind of focused on redesigning the general approach to the system outside of colors, and this is definitely, I think, the heaviest, craziest revision outside of going from the PlayStation 1 to the PS2, and it's a design that, while I wasn't sold on at first, has really grown on me with time. Now, obviously, we're at the very open of this generation, so there's all kinds of stuff that can happen over the next couple years, but as we have already seen with its opening weeks, the PS5 has been a massive success in terms of just raw sales, with opening pre-orders already topping off how many PS4s were sold over the first couple months. Though a lot of those are actually going to scalpers, so I guess we'll figure out what the real numbers are over time. Like with the PS4, the PS5 has had a renewed dedication on being first and foremost a gaming system. There's still attention to things like media services and some other side designs, but really everything is once again focused on the concept of having strong, awesome first-party titles, with a lot of great games already out at launch, like the new Spider-Man Miles Morales and a remake of Demon's Souls, and more great titles on the way very soon, like a brand new Ratchet & Clank, and the first sequel to happen for Horizon Zero Dawn with Horizon Forbidden West. While there are lots of things that can be talked about as far as what's different between the PS4 and the PS5, I think really the biggest thing that's really worth highlighting in terms of how PlayStation is pushing ahead into the future is their approach with the new DualSense controller. Aside from all the changes that happened over the course of the PS1 controller turning into the original DualShock, as well as the revisions that happened with the DualShock 3 and the DualShock 4, the DualSense is really the first huge change that's happened in a while, with a completely different looking controller while still maintaining the same general button outline that are honestly some of the most exciting aspects to me to this new approach to next gen, including a much more refined rumble feature that allows for all kinds of different feelings to come through the controller, and the adaptive triggers which can adjust tension depending on what's happening in game. It's honestly incredible to me to think about all the success that PlayStation has had and continue to try and hold on to throughout its many generations, all being owed to the fact that way back in the 90s, Nintendo decided to snub them a little bit. And because of that, we now have these new consoles. Not to mention all the great memories from the various franchises that came to be thanks to them. The systems have been home to a lot of great franchises, a lot of which are continuing to see new ones coming out with this next-gen system, with more new ones to be introduced in the future, and I cannot wait to see where it goes.